In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the exercises in Chapter 9. We're going to be focusing on exercise 9-1. Now, it's very important that you go through and read Chapter 9 because we're only going to be covering the basics of how to actually apply the dimensional tolerances in this video. We're not necessarily going to be talking about what all of the tolerances mean. Basically, these tolerances are to account for defects and variances in the manufacturing process for the parts that are created in the design world. The design world is considered to be perfect, where if you have something that is 38 millimeters, it is designed at 38 millimeters. There's no variation in the drawing. But when the person actually constructs it and mills it, or whatever machining process they use to create it, the chances of them getting exactly 38 millimeters is pretty slim, especially once you start getting down into 2 and 3 decimal places. There's going to be some variance because of tool wear or just any other types of reasons that could exist for the variances. So what dimensional tolerances do is they give kind of a buffer zone or a tolerance zone where somebody that's a quality inspector can go in. For example, in exercise 9-1, dimension 1 says that it's 38 plus or minus 0.05. Now, 0.05 is a pretty small dimension when we're talking about millimeters. That is 0.05 millimeters of variance. So when the QA inspector goes in and checks that dimension, which is dimension number 1, as long as it is between 37.95 and 38.05 millimeters, then that part is considered to be within specification. So with that in mind, we need to begin to implement these onto the CAD drawings. So what I've done is I've already got exercise 9-1 drawn up here, and I'm going to switch over to my layout tab. And just like we've done in the previous videos, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create my viewport. So I'm going to go to MV, enter, and I'm going to draw a viewport. And I'm going to draw the viewports pretty big since I've only got one drawing on the screen, or one view that's going to be in this. So then I'm going to click on here, go down to my scale, and I'm going to change this to a 1:1 scale. Click back on this, and now I'm going to change this to the viewports layer. And now it's not something that I have to worry about being printed out when this drawing gets plotted. So now the easiest way to do this is I'm just going to go to my dimension layer, and I'm going to apply the dimensions as they exist in the drawing. So we'll just start by putting in the dimension for here, and again, just using the same practices that we talked about in the last chapter, I can go through and dimension this. Now, the book is not really proportionate for this particular exercise, so it may look a little bit different. This section right here is 25, and this section right here is 25, but in the book, this looks like it's only about half of this. So just draw it to the dimensions that were given, and we're not necessarily going to worry about the proportion as it is on the drawing. So next we've got this little section right here that's going to come up, and I think I got the right click point, so I just wanted to zoom in and verify that. And then this next one will bring up right here, which is going to be 10, and then we've got from the edge to the center, and I don't like necessarily where this is placed because up here it's going to overlap one of my dimension lines. So I think what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to take that dimension 1 and I'm going to move it down here so that it's not interfering with anything else. So there we've got our 38 dimension over there, and then I need my angular dimension between here and here, which is going to come up as my 45 degrees. So I'm just going to double check and verify that I've got all the dimensions in here that I need to have in here. And at this point, I could begin to start applying some of my dimensional tolerances. Now to do this, I'm actually going to open up the properties window. And to do that, there's a couple ways you can do it. You can type PR enter, or you can go to view and click on properties. When this comes up, I'm actually going to dock it on the left-hand side of my screen. That way it's going to be there and it's not going to be just some floating window that I have to contend with. It's always going to be over here now. So I'm going to go back to my home tab, and when I click on a dimension here, what you'll notice is that it gives me all of the dimension properties. When we talked about creating our templates, we set all of this stuff up in our template file, so we don't want to go back into the dimension style and make any of these changes, especially considering that a lot of these are single use or one time only types of dimensions. So it's not something that we want to do all the time. So to get this started, I'm going to go in order of the dimensions from 1 through 10, and I'll show you why. So to start with, I've got this 38. When I click on this 38, it's going to give me all of the properties. If I click on these little symbols right here, the minus symbols, I can actually shrink everything all the way up to tolerances, because the tolerance is what I'm concerned with on this one. Now, in this, the book tells me that this is 38 plus or minus 0.05. So right here under tolerance display, I want to change this to symmetrical, and then it gives me the option to change this upper tolerance limit. So I'm going to type 0.05. And then you'll notice down here, when I come back into the main window and hit escape, it now has 38 plus or minus 0.05. Now, for this next step, I know that there's more than one dimension that has this plus or minus 0.05 applied to it. So I'm going to go to match properties, and I'm going to select this one right here. And if I look, dimension number 3 has the plus or minus 0.05, so I can click on this one. Dimension number 2 is a plus or minus 0.01, so that one's not going to work. As I go down here a little bit further, it looks like those are the only two with a plus or minus 0.05. So I can go ahead and end that command, and now there's one less dimension that I have to worry about. Dimension number 2, which is this 10 right here, when I click on it, I can go to symmetrical, and I can change this now to 0.1 and hit my enter button, and then I can just come back over here and hit escape, and it now has the 0.1 applied to it. Now again, I'm going to go to match properties, and I'm going to select on this 0.1, and if I look, dimension 5 and dimension 6 and dimension 10 all have that plus or minus 0.1 applied to them as well. So I can go through and I've got all of those done now. For the next dimension, which is dimension number 4, which is the angular dimension, this one is a limit dimension. It goes from 45.5 to 44.5. Now, in a lot of cases when you're given a limit dimension, it's always kind of a trick to know which one you actually dimension it to. And what I like to do is I like to use at least one of the whole numbers that's somewhere in the middle. And in this particular case, I've got 45.5 or 44.5. So what this really amounts to is a plus or minus 0.5 degrees. But when I click on this, what I want to do is come over here. And since this is an angular dimension instead of a regular dimension, I now have to go back in and reshrink all of these. I can also just scroll all the way down to the bottom. But for my tolerance on this, instead of none, I want to select limits. Now, my upper tolerance limit is going to be 0.5 degrees, and my lower tolerance limit is going to be 0.5 degrees. Now, what you'll notice when I come over here and hit escape, it now says 46 and 45. So there's something else that's going on here that I need to change so that I can get those half degrees in here. So when I click back on this, what you'll notice is that the tolerance precision is 0.00. And that means that it should be displaying with 2 decimal places. If I expand this out a little bit, we can see some of the other options. Tolerance suppress leading, and tolerance suppresses trailing zeros. I'm going to change this to no. And what I'm going to need to do in this particular case is go back to my primary units, which is right here. It's the one right above the tolerance where it says angle precision is 0, and I want to change that to have 1 decimal place. By changing that to 1 decimal place, we can look over here and see that it's now 45.5 and 44.5. So now that one is the way that it's supposed to be displayed. My next dimension is dimension 5. 5 and 6 are already done. 7 is going to be this dimension right here, which is going to be a +0 and a -0.1. So I'm going to click on this. And for my tolerance display, I am going to select deviation. What deviation does is it allows me to pick a different upper and lower value. My lower limit in this particular case is 0.1, and my upper limit is +0. So that's all I need to do in that one. So this is now 25 + 0 minus 0.1. Dimension number 8 is this one right here. So I'm going to click on this, and again, this is another deviation. So I'm going to come in here and select deviation. And this one here has an upper limit of 0.05 and a lower limit of 0. So I don't have to put anything in for that one. So now I've got 25 plus 0.05 minus 0. For dimension number 9, which is this 51 right here, this one here, I put this in at 51 because mathematically it worked for everything else. If this is 25 and this whole thing is 76, if I go 25 here and 25 here, that would make this segment right here 26. And if I take the 26 and add the 25 that this is, I get the 51. But now we've got a little bit of a limit thing that we need to work with here. So when I click on this, I want to change the tolerance display to limits. And for my lower limit, I am 0.25 under the 51. So I'll type 0.25. And that gives me the 50.75. And then for my upper limit, I am 0.5 above. I accidentally opened up the calculator. There's a calculator option right here in all of your limits so that you don't need to bring up the Windows calculator or pull up another calculator. You can just click on this button and put in what exactly you need it to be. Now, the other thing here is if I want to no longer suppress the trailing zeros on these tolerances, tolerance suppress trailing zeros, I can just say no. And what that'll do is that'll give both of these the same number of decimal places so that the tolerance is a little bit more consistent with itself. But there we have how to actually go through and put the tolerance values in on all of the dimensions for this particular exercise. So that is exercise 9-1 with all of the tolerances applied.